Okay, so if you're a PlayStation fan, it's probably because you've enjoyed one of Sony's exclusives over the years, and they have had many over all their consoles and portables. Whether it's first, second, or third party, these are big budget, very familiar games that people love and enjoy, like Uncharted, Last of Us, God of War, going further back, Resistance, Infamous. A lot of games people are very familiar with. But what we're going to do in this video actually is take a look at 20 PlayStation exclusives that you probably don't know about. So let's get right into it. Actually, before we dive into it, we should actually mention real quick, so out of all these 20 games, Sony does own and retain the IP to every single title here, and every single deal is different. Obviously, they're second and third party developers for some of these games. Some of them are Sony internally developed, but some are second party, and that, of course, entails Sony either funding the game or just providing the marketing rights for the game or what have you, but they do retain the IP to all these titles. And there are also scenarios where Sony may be the original publisher for the territory that the game initially launched in, but decided not to launch the game in other territories, whereas another publisher would come in and sort of take care of that. So there are situations where the game was published by either Atlas or Eidos or whatever publisher stepped in for each particular title, but when Sony's the original publisher, they do have the IP ownership. And there's plenty of examples of that with more modern games. Demon's Souls is a good example. Sony owns the IP for Demon's Souls, but they did not publish it in the US. So keep that in mind. And actually, if you go even further back before Sony was a hardware manufacturer, they had a publishing label called Sony ImageSoft. And this actually, they published, I believe, a few Nintendo games like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and then Altered Space. I think that was a Game Boy game. And so that actually is also pretty interesting because I think Sony also retains the IP to those games as well. Might be a little bit different because that's back on Nintendo hardware. I don't, maybe they still retain the IP, but I would assume they do. But either way, just a little factoid there. But to start off our list, we'll actually start off with titles that I think most people are familiar with, but we'll get further and further into obscurity. So actually, we'll start with Folklore on the PlayStation 3. This was back in 2007. This was one of those very early PS3 exclusives. Folklore, it's an action role-playing game where you play as a journalist named Keats and a young woman named Ellen, and you're trying to uncover this mystery of the village named Doolin. And the game is almost like Pokemon in the sense that enemies you encounter can be captured and then used later. But this game's centered around using the 6-axis motion controller to sort of reel in the enemies. It's almost like it's a fishing line where you kind of tug back on the controller to sort of tug the soul out of this enemy. And after you successfully reeled them in, then you could map them to the controls for attacks later. And the game saw mostly favorable reviews. It's just one of those titles where Sony never pursued a sequel or anything like that. I feel like there's a semi-small cult following. I mean, this was a more recent title, so people certainly know this game and remember it, but it's more niche for sure, and not many people know about it. Another title that I feel like a lot of people probably do know, but again, discretionary, is Mr. Mosquito. This was on the PlayStation 2. Very weird game. This was definitely a strange game, but it was also really fun. And the premise is like exactly what you think it is. You're this mosquito inside the Yamada household, and you're trying to suck enough blood to survive the upcoming winter. And you're tasked with flying around the environment and sucking certain parts of the body without being detected. And if you are detected, the human will become under duress and eventually start to attack you. A lot of people remember this game, but notably because it did see a release outside of Japan. And I mention that because what a lot of people don't know is that the game actually did have a sequel. It just never came to the US, and that was called Kato, Let's Go to Hawaii. This was in 2003. Unsurprisingly, this was more of the same. I mean, the Yamada family is now on vacation to Hawaii, which you would probably assume so based on the title, and you now have the option to suck more parts of the body, and there's like new bonuses that are floating around and things like that. And yeah, this game never saw localization, and which is unfortunate because a lot of people this is kind of another cult following for the game. I remember this so well too. Like a lot of people really wanted this game to get localized, and there was kind of this like small little group of people that were like sort of petitioning and trying to get Sony's attention to like get the ball rolling here. Super quirky game. I love that kind of stuff, and it sucks that there's not more Mr. Mosquito. Now, going back to the PlayStation 3, there is Africa, and this was initially shown off during Sony's 2006 E3 press conference, but little was really known about it because you didn't even really know what you were doing. It's just sort of generic B-roll of pretty-looking animals on PlayStation 3 hardware. But the game actually did release 2 years later, and you're a photographer taking pictures of all the animals that you encountered. And this game got mixed reviews, but today it's actually a pretty rare PS3 game. It doesn't fetch for that high of a price, but certainly it's held its value very well. And to be honest, I kind of low-key want a sequel to this game for some strange reason. I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it's because I love animals, but I would be down for more Africa. Next up, we've got Pet in TV. And if you thought pet simulation games may have had their rise to fame on the DS, it goes back much further than that. Sony created this monstrosity in 1997. I'm not entirely sure what this guy's supposed to be. I can only assume it's the love child of a Kinder Egg and Wally, but you can let this little dude walk around and learn its environment, and you can take care of it, and then I don't know. I mean, I honestly don't know. Look at this thing. Now, the next game is on the PlayStation 2. It's Guy Atonement. This game received a fair amount of buzz back in the day, but it unfortunately didn't sell all that well, and it reviewed okay. It was like mixed reviews. It's a turn-based RPG that's a bit more medieval looking, where the protagonist must atone for his sins after angering the gods. So he's got to go to this nearby village and be courteous to the citizens and complete tasks as a sign of goodwill. I find the premise of this game to be pretty interesting, and I wouldn't mind seeing this game being given a modern take in some way, but that might also be because I want more turn-based RPGs in my life. Moving on to Fanta Vision. This one's interesting because it's one of those games that started off as a tech demo, and Sony seems to do this a lot with tech demonstrations. They just always end up turning into final games. It's like they don't want to waste those resources. So this game actually turned into a puzzler with fireworks getting shot into the sky, and this laser beam cursor thing is what you use to sort of line them up and string them together for a high score. And this was actually also a PlayStation 2 launch title, so for a lot of people this isn't super obscure. A lot of people remember this one, but it's kind of funny because this was Sony developed and Sony owned, and actually a lot of people were also reintroduced to this game because it got re-released on PlayStation 4 as a PS2 emulated game with trophy support. So that's also pretty cool. So if you actually liked what you just saw, you can actually play this today on your PS4. Going back to the really weird format, we got The Last Guy on PS3. So this game was downloadable early into the PS3's life cycle. It did get a disc release at some point, I think. And the concept is definitely unique. So this is another really oddball Sony Japan studio title that centers around giant monsters taking over the world. And so you being the last guy, run around a top-down sort of Google map view, and you find survivors and you have to guide them to these safe zones in a designated amount of time. And games like this, I really wish we had more of, because it's like totally different, and at the time it launched at an affordable $10, and it was just plain fun, right? You didn't have to think about it, you didn't have to sort of worry about, spending too much money. It was just this really weird, obscure game for a very affordable price. So, Baby Universe, this is kind of a, rhythm games are certainly something that Sony's dabbled in, and that's essentially what Baby Universe is. So, this was in 1997. It wasn't really a game, it's more of a music visualizer for your CDs. So you could put anything into the CD tray, and this software would create like a kaleidoscope visualization for you. Pretty cool. This was only released in Japan and PAL territories, so it's not really a game essentially. But moving on to a music rhythm game that actually is a game is Beats. This was on the PSP in 2007. This was downloadable only, and this actually had some pretty dope gameplay. I actually liked this game a lot. I probably put about 20 hours into it. What this game would do is read the music off your memory stick and turn that into gameplay, right? So it's got the phase buttons, and you sort of line the phase buttons up with the beat of the music. And it was actually pretty accurate sometimes, worked pretty well, and I believe this game came out at a very affordable, like $4.99, I think. I don't think it was $10 back then when it launched, but I played a lot of this game. I actually liked it a lot. It was a good way to listen to music and sort of, play a game at the same time, more or less. But staying on topic of PSP, now we're moving on to Blade Dancer, Lineage of Light. So this game was another pretty cool PSP exclusive. Didn't really get all that much attention. It's a turn-based RPG, so that's really all I need. But it had a crafting system, this sort of gimmicky skill system, but it had its own little charm. And this game received mixed reviews, and didn't really take long for people to really forget about this game. Now, hopefully a few of you remember this one, but Blasto on the PlayStation 1 in 1998. Now, I don't know, maybe this game is more well-known, but whenever I bring it up in conversation, no one seems to know what I'm talking about. Blasto is this third-person action platforming game where the protagonist makes these really funny remarks and anecdotes throughout the gameplay, which is what I think most people back then really enjoyed about the game rather than actually playing it, because the gameplay was kind of like hard to control, and it was just very stiff. The voice actor for this game, Phil Hartman, the guy that voiced Blasto, he actually passed away a few months after this game came out, and that's kind of like the one thing people really enjoyed about the game. But I think something like this, quite honestly, with the right voice talent and people that are really passionate about the IP, I think this could have some sort of reimagining today, certainly. Motor Toon Grand Prix. Now this quirky, weird cartoon racer has the title of being Sony's first internally developed game. Now, it wasn't really anything special, the game reviewed alright, but it was also designed by well-known developer Kazunori Yamauchi, best known for the Gran Turismo franchise today. But moving on to another PS1 game, we've got Firebugs. Now this game is pretty unique in the sense that it was only released in PAL territories and it launched well into the PS2's life cycle. It was a racing game that had a few modes and actually had some good reviews, to be honest. So there's not really all that much to say about Firebugs, just that it was one of those games that was really meant to sort of keep the PS1 going. Ecco Chrome. This was in 2008 for PS3 and PSP, and Ecco Chrome was a really great puzzle game that had this very simplistic presentation. The game essentially hinges on this sort of impossible construction concept to create puzzles that must be solved by the player, and your nondescript little character would walk on the beams and must be guided properly. And you know, honestly, when I look at this game, I think it would do pretty well as an iOS or Android game today. Maybe something Sony's mobile studio ForwardWorks should work on. It could be the next Monument Valley, I don't know. I mean, that seems like the kind of place where it could be today. Gangs of London, this was 2006 on the PSP. This was developed by Sony's London studio. As you can expect, you're a gang member in London. It was an open world style GTA game. Very much so looks like one of those typical GTA clones, but you know, you run around, you commit some good old crimes that those London gangs love to do. And you know, this game didn't really review all that well, and the gangs probably disbanded, and probably for good reason. Now moving on, we got Ghost Hunter, and this game was developed by SE Cambridge back in the day, and there is no doubt about it, you hunt ghosts in this game, if there was any doubt in your mind. I know it's a shock to many of you, as it was for me, but you do run around shooting ghosts, and you capture them with these like grenades, and you know, for its time, this was actually a very pretty game. I remember this game having a pretty big reputation for being one of the best-looking PlayStation 2 games graphically, and I think it had a lot of potential back then, but it was just another title that it didn't really perform all that well critically or commercially, so that's kind of a shame. Then we've got Jinx on the PS1 2003. This is another example of an exclusive releasing well into the PS2's life cycle, simply to sort of bolster what life the PS1 had left in it, which was still a lot. Jinx is a 3D platformer that follows all the traditional values of a platformer, in that there's tons of environments to traverse, there's some enemies to avoid, and puzzles to solve. It was a pretty good game. Now, I always butcher the name of this game, but Aconcagua, it was only released in Japan, and this was a game about a plane crash on a mountain where this journalist named Kato has to guide the remaining survivors down the mountain, and this game is pretty plot heavy and has a lot of cutscenes. I would have liked to see this game come to the West, and apparently it was supposed to, but it never did, which is a bit of a shame. Especially considering it was a point-and-click adventure, which you don't really see much of on consoles, and albeit PS1 does have a decent amount of, you know, point-and-click adventures, but still a Western release would have been welcomed. So for the final game, some of you may know about this one, but Rule of Rose on the PlayStation 2. This game is rare, and it has an interesting story behind it. It's a horror survival game, but it's based around psychological horror, and it's focusing on the idea of childhood. So you play as this girl named Jennifer, and you move around these environments with these imp-like enemies and creatures all running around, and all you can do is like use melee attacks and melee objects, but they don't really work all that well. It's like better suited if you kind of avoid them. And basically what happened with this game is that it stirred up the impression that there's like violence against children, and it became this big hot topic for release in other territories. So the European Union didn't want this game to be released, and they called for the PEGI rating to be reevaluated. The game never came to Australia or New Zealand, I think, and Sony didn't want to pursue a US release, so that was actually published by Atlas, I think. And not many copies were sold due to its reputation. So actually, copies of this game are pretty rare. They go for anywhere from $250 for a pretty bad beat-up copy to $400, $500 for a very good copy. It's certainly the kind of game you definitely want in your collection if you are the kind of person that wants to bolster a very big library of very rare and collectible games. But that's pretty much it. Those are all the low-key obscure PlayStation exclusives that I wanted to share with you all. And admittedly, I probably could have included a few more, because Sony's still got such a long history of exclusives. But I did try to pick out more interesting ones. And also, I don't know how long the video is going to go on with just 20 games, so I don't want to keep babbling on about forever, despite what some of you want. That's not a good idea. But thank you so much for watching. Let me know if there were some games in there that you did not recognize, or if there were some games that you did recognize. As always, it's a conversational channel. Go ahead and talk it up. And if you haven't yet, subscribe for the best PlayStation news, reviews, and updates here on YouTube. And that's essentially it. That's it for me in this video, and I will see you all in the next one. You take it easy.